Welcome to You, Me, Empathy, a safe place for leading with your heart. Hey, thanks for being here. You, Me, Empathy is the official podcast of the Feely Human Collective, a collaborative mental health community designed to empower each of us to grow our capacity for empathy, vulnerability, and emotional wayfinding. Just a friendly reminder that this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Known as just a silly boy with a feely heart. You can support the show by leaving a review in Apple Podcasts, following us on social media at Yumi Empathy and Feely Human, and joining the Feely Human Collective community at feelyhuman.co. And now your host, Known Wells.
Hello, Feely Humans. Welcome to another episode of You, Me, Empathy. My name is Known Wells. This is episode 140 on surviving the Boston Marathon bombing with Manya Chylinski. Manya is a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing that happened in April 2013. I remember that day very vividly, even though I'm not someone who lives in Boston, but it was a tragic day for our country and certainly for the folks involved. And Manya was one of those people. She was witness to that bombing, and she now speaks on the topic of trauma and comparing trauma. And this was her story is very terrifying, but it's also exceptionally inspiring. We talk about exploring the messy middle. We talk about challenging our own biases and preconceptions about people in the world. And we talk about trauma a lot. And then Manya's specific experience at the Boston Marathon bombing. It's a really, really powerful episode. Hope you enjoy it. Before we get to the episode, though, I wanted to remind you to please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts for Yumi Empathy. It does help out the show. If you also want to support me financially, or there's some other non-financial ways to support me and the podcast and Feely Human, go to feelyhuman.co/support. That's feelyhuman.co/support. And there are 10 ways there for you to support this podcast. Give Yumi Empathy and Feely Human a follow on the socials at Feely Human, at Yumi Empathy on Instagram, and we have Facebook pages as well. Just search for Yumi Empathy and Feely Human. If you're listening to this on the day it drops, I am driving back from 4 days in the woods. Hopefully, I'm driving back. If not, I was eaten by a bear, or I got lost and I'm starving to death, or something like that. I don't know if Jessica wants to hear that, but presumably I'm driving back and have enjoyed a wonderful commune with sweet Mama Nene, Mother Nature. She's the best. She is the best. I love her. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for being a part of this community. I really love you guys. Yeah, really, really do. It's an honor each week to be here with you. I really do mean that. So thank you. Thank you for being a part of it. Please check out Feely Human, and if you're a writer or you are an artist or anything like that. Actually, speaking of artists, I have this illustration idea for Feely Human, and if you're an illustrator that your style is maybe cartoony and intricate, I'd love to hear from you. I've got an idea. I'd love to collaborate. Just DM me on Instagram at Feely Human, and check out the site feelyhuman.co. Leave reviews, join the Facebook groups, all that stuff. You guys know the drill. Thank you for being here. Enjoy this episode 140 on surviving the Boston Marathon bombing with Manya Chylinski.
You and me. You, me, empathy, yeah, la, la, la.
Welcome to You, Me, Empathy, a podcast about exploring the struggles we face in our day-to-day lives as humans trying to get by on this wondrous and overwhelming pale blue dot. The intent of You, Me, Empathy is to talk openly, without judgment, about our mental health, our neuroses, our shared anxieties and worries, to create a dialogue that is vulnerable and deeply human and empathetic, and to share that dialogue with others to inspire emotional and cognitive collaboration and insight, so we can, hand in hand, break down the stigma that make us feel shame and guilt for struggling, for feeling our feelings, for being feely humans. You, Me, Empathy is a safe, friendly space designed to inspire the beauty in each of us. Today, I am overjoyed to be connecting with writer, speaker, and trauma resilience researcher, Manya Chylinski. Hello, Manya.
Hi, Noan. I'm thrilled to be with you this afternoon as well.
Excellent. Well, you had reached out to me a number of months ago, and your story is quite profound and touching, and talk about resilience. So I'm very excited to get to know you a little better and share your story with the listeners. I think there's a lot of great stuff coming to you, listeners. So I'm excited to connect.
I'm excited to connect too, and I'm really happy to get to share my story with you and with my listeners, especially today in the world we're living in right now. It feels like maybe thinking about trauma and how people react to that can be really helpful for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Before we get into your story though, Manya, let's do an emotional check-in. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling mostly okay. Been having a little bit of anxiety over the last couple days, mostly due to just the way we're living our lives right now. Nothing in particular, but this morning has been pretty good so far.
That's good. What's is the anxiety just from kind of the current state of things? The listeners should know that we're recording this in the time of coronavirus, which seems to be like all of the recordings nowadays. It's just henceforth, in coronavirus. I think that's like the implication, but is it due to kind of stuff going on with that?
It is largely due to coronavirus and the response, sheltering in place. Like a lot of people, I'm getting a little antsy. So, I've had my ups and downs kind of dealing with the emotional side of what's happening to all of us and how I'm individually dealing with it, but knowing that it's affecting so many people sometimes can also be difficult for me.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, as someone who, considers himself like pretty empathetic and sort of thinks about that stuff all the time, it's certainly a challenging time in those terms because there's still a lot of, things we don't know, right? And like what should we do? What can we do? What is sort of reasonable and safe, and it's confusing.
It is very confusing. I think speaking for myself personally, I like to be able to kind of put a box around things and know this is the start, this is the end, and this is what I need to do to deal with it. That isn't what's happening right now, as we know. We don't really know when this is going to end, and thinking too far ahead can be quite difficult and quite painful. And the other side for me is seeing how other people are dealing with it. Some are taking it more seriously than I am, perhaps, and some people are taking it less seriously. And when those are people, friends or family, I'm finding it difficult to deal with when people have kind of a different approach to what they think they need to do to protect themselves and to protect others.
Right. And that's I had Esme Wang on, and she had mentioned, this time is really a really big exercise in empathy, right? Because we don't, like, it's hard, like, we have, as humans, like I talk about it a lot on the show, we like to put things in boxes, right? We like to have clear sort of understanding of, like, okay, what this means, how is this going to impact me? Like, when is it going to end? Clear guidelines, these types of things. But there's really none of that right now. And we're not getting that really at the federal level. Things are very different, even state to state, and so,
Yes.
and then, you're right. Like, person to person, we all have our different reactions to it. And, an initial perception for some folks could be like, okay, this person is being cavalier, or this person is not considering others. But I think that's too easy. I think that's like a simplification of, like, maybe what's going on. And so I think it's important to maybe try to understand and unpack that stuff.
Yes. And I have worked at switching my mindset, because my first thought, seeing somebody outside without a mask, or somebody going the wrong way in the newly made one-way aisle at the supermarket, my first thought is anger and frustration at this person and this choice that they have made. And I've worked very hard to kind of flip that script and think to myself, I don't know what's going on in this person's life. I don't know why they're doing what they're doing. Instead, I'm going to be grateful for the people who are in the supermarket who are doing it correctly and who are wearing their masks, and trying to, be more understanding that people are bringing so many different points of view to this. And it isn't all necessarily just, as you say, cavalier. Some people, I know someone who really cannot wear a mask. So she doesn't go out very much because she doesn't want to be outside without a mask. Perhaps some of these people that I see without masks also really can't do something like that. So I'm working on that empathy.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard though. Empathy is a practice. It's a skill. It's nuanced. And I tend to believe that, the vast majority of people are, like, wanting to do what is quote unquote right in the situation. Like, they care about others. They think about others. I do believe that in my heart, that, the vast majority of people are like that. And, whether their actions are sort of aligned with that or not, like, right now it's hard to say, but, like, I do believe and like to look at the world in that way, and that, the vast majority of us are just trying to do our best,
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I like to look at the world that way as well. And that's, this has been an interesting experience of kind of living my own truth, of thinking that I think most people are mostly good most of the time. Most people are trying. Most people, if you kind of question them, would say and be right that they truly care about others. So it was interesting to kind of see my mindset to instantly shift to, what is wrong with these people? They must not care about me or my health or my family. And I had to really think about, wait, how can I hold those two truths at the same time if I think most people are doing their best? But in this circumstance, I'm really angry at people for doing what I think is wrong. I really had to sit with that and think about what that meant.
Yeah. No, I'm so grateful that you're talking about this, because it is so important. And it's important even, when it comes to the lens of mental health, right? Like, I think there's a lot more nuance in how we operate as humans, and, what is right, wrong, etc. Like, and I think it's easy to forget about that stuff when it comes to these types of situations. And I think that, we just, it's, I'll just say that it's a challenge. It is a challenge. It's hard. It's difficult. But I do think that like having an open heart and understanding that people are trying and giving them that benefit of the doubt, unless they're doing something like, completely sort of, intentionally idiotic, I think we need to like, give people a little grace. Yeah.
I agree. And it has been, since my trauma and all that I've learned in healing through that, which I know we'll talk about, I have become much more empathetic and much more compassionate and understanding that people may be coming from or maybe are coming from a place I don't necessarily always understand. So it was, like I said, it was kind of interesting to run into this situation and realize that when my safety is feeling threatened, all of that went out the window kind of as my initial response. So working to get that back.
Yeah. It is so interesting talking about like the trauma piece of it. You're right. We all sort of experience a thing and we have different reactions to it. And I think, when it comes to trauma, I think when we do the work of, right, exploring it and thinking about it and understanding how it's impacted us, it does open up that, and I'm glad to hear it has for you, it does open up that capacity for empathy because we start to get outside of our own perceptions, right? And that's like what this time is. It's like a time of like, we are our own sort of biases and our own preconceptions about the way the world should be or the way we should act is being challenged, right? And I think that that's a crucial component of empathy. The first sort of exploring our traumas, exploring our experiences in trauma, right? Mm-hmm. And then allowing that to challenge our biases, our misconceptions, our preconceptions, our insular black and white ways that we look at the world.
Yes. Yes. Black and white made me giggle. 'Cause I would, prior to my trauma would have said I'm a very black and white thinker. I'm not as likely to say that about most things these days. And, through the lens of trauma, I mean, we are as a society going through a mass trauma, and it's just taking a really long time to play out. It's, like a hurricane or a tornado or mass violence. It's just the time it's taking is so much longer. And so I think from where I sit, it seems like many of the struggles and the emotions that other people are dealing with, or all of us are dealing with, are kind of coming from this as a trauma and this threatening our safety. And as a trauma survivor, I don't know, but I wonder if I kind of came into this with maybe more skills than I realized in how to deal with the emotional side of what's going on to all of us right now.
Yeah. I'd imagine you do have those, a few more skills. And, if we're comparing you to someone who maybe hasn't experienced like big traumas like this, like I think that makes sense. So let's get into your story a little bit. I'm curious. Let's jump off of, I'm curious about like the black and white thinking, that like where you were at prior to this, experience you had, which, you can share about in a bit, but I'm curious about just what did that look like, that black and white thinking prior to this, traumatic experience that you had?
When it comes to sort of the emotional side of my life and relationships and things, I think it very much fell down as you like me or you don't. And there's there's no such thing as any gray area. You're either my friend or you're not. And that would sort of, I think, kind of dictate how I was dealing with people and how I was attempting to understand things. I would filter them through, well, that behavior, indicates that they don't like me. So I am now going to behave as if this person is, not part of my life. But, sometimes those people still actually were part of my life. And I think I found it very difficult to understand and manage the messy middle where, yes, I still like you. And yes, I am angry at you. Or, yes, we are friends. And yes, I did actually just do this horrible thing that hurt you. And I'm sorry. Though that I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I realized how hard that was for me to process.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you suppose that you were at that place of black and white thinking? Because I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. I think there's a control there, there's a protection there, there's all sorts of things probably that can contribute to that frame of thinking.
I think for me, it was self-protection. I do have big emotions. I am an empathetic person, and it certainly before my trauma was often, I didn't know that. And it was harder to manage the deep emotions or my deep caring. And so the only way that it seemed I could kind of protect myself was to just build a wall and put all the difficult things on the other side of the wall.
Mm-hmm. I've been there.
Yes, I'm sure some of your listeners have as well.
Yeah. It's scary to be on the other side of the wall because it is, as you pointed out, in that middle, it is very messy. But that's a reflection of who we are. That's a reflection of the world, right? It is messy.
Yes. And I appreciate that so much more now after all the work I've done to heal from the trauma and to understand that it is messy, but sometimes that's where the really good stuff is too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about this trauma we're kind of dancing around. Tell us about the experience for the listeners.
Yes. So just so everybody doesn't have to stay on the edges of their seats, I am a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing, which took place in April of 2013. And it's hard to realize sometimes that it's been 7 years since that happened, because there are days when it feels like it could only have been last week. And then there are other times where I've integrated it so well into my life. I think, gosh, that was only 7 years ago. But I'll tell you my experience, because just saying the words that I'm a survivor of the bombing don't really explain it. I live not far from the finish line and went to the finish of the marathon every year, not because I'm a runner or particularly fond of the sport of running, but because it was this great party, and the day is a holiday in Massachusetts, and there's this, big worldwide event happening basically on my doorstep. So I loved to go and watch the runners come in, and especially would get there early to see the elite runners, because they are a complete different breed than the non-elite runners and the more recreational runners. But I always stayed for everybody, because it is such an accomplishment to run 26 miles. So in 2013, my friend had gotten us tickets for the bleacher seats, which are right in front of the finish line. And our tickets were good for 2:00 on. So by then, the elite runners and the people who get money for winning the race had already gone. And it was now by 2:00, I think it was about 4 hours into the race. And a lot of folks, I can't believe you could run 26 miles in 4 hours, but they were starting to cross the finish line. And so it was just really exciting to be so close to the finish line and to hear the announcer calling everybody's name. And that's where I was standing at 2:49 when a bomb went off directly across the street from where I was standing in the bleachers. And I was frozen in place. I happened to be looking straight ahead. So I was looking at it as it exploded and, saw the smoke kind of getting taller and wider and bigger, and watched the people on that side of the street kind of, run away in what looked to me like ripples on a pond. And I was just frozen. I couldn't see anything other than this tunnel vision directly across the street. I would have told you I was standing there alone in the bleachers. I didn't see anybody else around me. I couldn't hear anything. I was just, a statue. And I saw, to me, it looked like after the initial rush of people running out of the way, it looked like there were no other people left on that side of the street. Partly there was a fence and some flags that I was looking through. And partly, I think I didn't want to see the people over there. And I saw a woman standing in front of what at the time was a Lens Crafters, and they had a big plate glass window and it had shattered. And there was a pile of glass on the street, and she was standing there. And inasmuch as I was having any thoughts, I had thought just two things. One was they just ruined the Boston Marathon. And then as I'm looking at this woman, I don't understand how she's still standing there, because I knew it was a bomb. And I must have known people were hurt and injured, and I couldn't figure out how she was still just standing there and seeming to be okay. And while my brain was trying to click over and figure out what that meant, the second bomb went off. So I turned and looked and realized it was another bomb, and, saw the smoke rising about half a block away, and realized, yeah, I think we have to get out of here. So I said that to my friend. And
so you were still in the bleachers at that point?
Yes, we were still in the bleachers, still just, for me, just standing there stock still. And you may, if you think about it, what are bleachers like? The only way to get out is to walk down the stairs. And in our case, that meant getting closer to the bombing site, which this wasn't a conscious choice on my part, but I just looked straight down at my feet as I stepped over the benches and people's bags and everything that got left. And I never looked up across the street as we got closer, and came down off the bleacher seats and was being directed down the street, and in fact was actually being directed to closer where the medical tent was, even though I couldn't see in the medical tent, but that's where they ended up taking a lot of the folks who were physically injured. And I was there with 4 other people, and I evacuated. I could only find one other person. We sort of stopped and stood there waiting to see if the other people had come around the corner or where we could find them. And I just was sobbing. And just, that was the first of many, many episodes that afternoon. I would just we'd be standing there. We all finally found each other. We're standing there together, trying to figure out what to do. And I would just burst into tears. No surprise, that happened a lot in those first few hours and days.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's there's a lot of questions running through my brain, and I just want to first thank you for sharing that, and I can't imagine sort of going through that type of thing. It's strange, and I'm wondering if this was the case for you. Like my concept of like bombings and things are in the context of like television or movies, right, or things like that, and seeing one in real life. I've never seen one in real life, and I wonder for you, like, you mentioned that you realized it was a bomb, but did you realize it the first time that happened, or was it just kind of this instinctual, like, sort of deep grained understanding that, like, okay, there was this loud explosion that had to have been a bomb? Like, what was going on through your mind on in regards to that?
There wasn't a lot of conscious effort in that regard. I think it just was somehow ingrained because, maybe my brain was, what else could it be?
Right.
I know some people who weren't as close thought that it was maybe like a gas line, as what are they called? Manhole cover, like blowing up.
Yeah.
I know somebody who was not far from me when this happened, and they thought it was a water cannon. So other people didn't necessarily go to, this is a bomb, but to me, I would have been very surprised if somebody told me it had been something else, because my whole experience in that moment was, this is a bomb.
Right.
And I am not in the military. I have no reason to have ever been anywhere where a bomb was going off. Like you, my experience was, TV and the movies and news and hearing about it in war zones.
And so the first bomb went off and you were in the bleachers, and you were how far away from it, roughly?
Roughly 40 feet across the street.
Yeah.
Ish. I actually have never gone to figure out how wide is the street, where was I, but I'd say it's about 40 feet.
Yeah. And how long between the first bomb and the second bomb?
12 seconds.
Oh, wow. Okay. My goodness. I mean, that's brutal. I remember that happening and just thinking, like, my initial response was like, of course, like, this is devastating, and people were hurt, and some people died, right?
Yes. 3 individuals were killed essentially instantly after the bombs went off, and 2 other individuals died as a result of the entire event. So 5 total.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I heard about this and sort of thinking through it, and of course, one of my responses, we live in the United States where there are acts of violence like this, right, that happen, and a lot of them, with guns involved. You think, like, one of my, may perhaps sort of very sad reactions was like, oh, again? Like, this is happening again? Like that type of response, which is just like, it makes me sad to say that, but it was one of my reactions.
I'm not surprised. I would imagine other people felt the same. And I guess what was unique about it was that it was a bombing versus a shooting, which is unfortunately something we feel like we hear a lot of in the news.
Right.
So it was a little bit different, but I would imagine a lot of people had that very same feeling.
Yeah. So, you're there, you see these 2 bombs go off, you sort of find your way to this medical tent, and what are they telling you? What, like, are you getting treated? Are you being talked to?
So I did not go into the medical tent. I just went to we just ended up meeting in a space that was outside where the medical tent was. And so I was told nothing. I spoke to no officials. The only people of any authority who I encountered in the entire time were a couple of volunteers for the Boston Athletic Association, who runs the marathon, that were in the bleachers or near the bleachers. And one of them was kind of telling us, everybody come this way, go this way. I can't remember what he was saying, but he was directing people out of the bleachers. And then that was it. I didn't have any involvement with any officials because I was able to walk away. And if you think about, what was happening in the moment, nobody knew the number of bombs that were going to go off. So one goes off, that's horrible. But then when a second one goes off, that suggests something different. Right. And I think for anybody who was involved in crowd control or their response, I imagine that just every thought they had was just get these people out of here because we don't know what's happening. And once we dispersed, we were no longer, near the finish line. We were no longer where the police or EMS or anybody needed to be. So then we were just on our own trying to figure out, do we go home? Do we wait? What's happening? We just didn't know what to do.
Right. I mean, how could you? Such a it's weird to say it's a once in a lifetime experience, but it is, right? Yes. It shouldn't happen at all, but it is, a unique trauma. And how could you know how to respond to something like that? And, I'd imagine there's a lot of feeling of just I don't know what to do, kind of stuck, sort of still, kind of just, trying to process whatever the heck happened, and it being very confusing.
It was confusing. And when my friends and I all gathered up again, we were waiting near one of the subway stations. And at one point somebody said, should we wait inside? Would that be safer? Because we had no idea what was going on. And somehow all together we agreed, no, it would be worse to be inside. And looking back on that particular moment, I just kind of smile because we had just been outside where there was a bomb. So what made us think it was safer outside versus inside? I don't know. But I think it's just one of those kind of calculations you're making when you have no idea how to deal with what's happening.
Right. Right. And walk me through your next, basically the rest of the day, the next couple of days. What was the experience like?
We made our way home, which was a little bit difficult because they shut down the Boylston Street where the finish line is, and we had to walk around that. And now there were sirens and police and ambulances going all over. So we were trying to figure out what happened. A few people had been able to connect via text with others. So we knew they were bombs. By the time we started walking home, which was maybe, 45 minutes or an hour later, we knew that 3 people had been killed. So we were, able to kind of understand in as much as anybody could at that moment. What was interesting to me is we encountered a lot of people once we got out of the finish line area and were over by the subway station. We encountered a lot of people who were very agitated and very afraid, but didn't actually know what had happened because they weren't on Boylston Street. And I remember thinking at the time how odd it was to feel like I could help them because I could help them understand what was happening because I had seen it. I could say to them, a bomb went off and that's what you heard. And that's why everybody's running away. And somebody came up to us and asked if we knew if any runners had been hurt. And they explained that their person who'd been running they had seen the notice that they had crossed the finish line. And it was a few seconds later that they heard the sound of the bomb go off. And so we were able to say, okay, well, this is where the bomb was in relationship to the finish line. So if your person was past it, they're probably okay. And it felt weird to have that kind of knowledge because I had been there, but it felt really important to help these people who were very afraid, but just didn't have any idea what was happening. Then, like I mentioned earlier, I cried a lot on the way home and got home and did what probably everybody else did, which is turned on the news to find out what just happened. And, probably didn't peel myself away from the news the whole night or much of the next few days. But it was over the next couple of days that I realized, so, I didn't have any physical injuries. No shrapnel, nothing. I felt like I must be fine. I witnessed this horrible thing. I witnessed a murder, but I'm fine. But over the next few days, I realized that wasn't really the case. I was really struggling to concentrate at work. I wasn't really sleeping. When I was sleeping, I was having just dreadful nightmares. Wasn't eating very well. All of the distressing symptoms you might imagine, I was probably having them. And just really struggling with feeling that I should feel fine because I wasn't physically hurt. So I'm supposed to be okay. And I started watching the news with a little bit more of an eye to, well, if I'm feeling this way, I wonder if other people are. So they'll be talking about that on the news. And they weren't. The police chief wasn't talking about it in his press conferences. That wasn't showing up on the news. And even as I was walking by well-known reporters from CNN who had set up not far from my front door. So I'm, walking past Wolf Blitzer and Anderson Cooper and then watching them, live, then coming home and watching them live with my, neighbor's front door in their background. None of them were talking about me or people like me. So I started to think it was just me, that obviously everybody else was fine, but I can't deal with this.
I want to pause there for a second because it's so important on many levels. And I think we as humans do this to ourselves, right? We should ourselves. And as my friend Jen Pasloff said, should is an asshole. We say we should be this way because this is maybe the experience that we think is common. We have this perception that we didn't get hurt physically, so we should be fine. There's that should. We compare, right? And then we forget about, that's where the stigma is, right? We have this perception culturally that, when you have a cold or you break your arm or whatever, all these physical things that happen. These are the things that get talked about, as you're pointing out, as you're making very clear in this real life example. The reality is, of course, that the inward sort of mental health piece of it is just as important. It's just harder to talk about because we don't talk about it. It's harder to engage with it because it's very nuanced, right? And
Yes.
it's hard to come to terms with it as a person who's experienced a trauma, right? Like for you, I was sort of taken aback by you saying like you tried to go back to work. Like what, like, did you feel like, I mean, obviously you felt like you should be fine in that moment. Like, oh, I'm fine. Like I wasn't hurt, but like going back to work, like that seems bonkers to me, but I get it. I get it.
Well, I should also say I work from home, so
Okay, yeah.
going back to work wasn't quite as big a decision as it might be for other people.
Right.
But on one hand, like, what else do you do? Like,
Right.
I didn't know what else to do. And on a normal Tuesday after the marathon, I would just wake up and go to work. And I was on a conference call, and it was a company here in Boston, and everybody on the call works somewhere in the greater Boston area. So I had to think every single one of them knew what had happened, but not one person brought it up. Like even in the intro conversations where you're checking in with the weather and how's this, and today we're checking in on people's health. There was nothing. Nobody mentioned it at all. And that seemed so surreal to me. But then I thought, well, it isn't a thing for other people. It is just me. I'm the only one who's spending all day thinking about it. And when I was on that call with them, I remember this so distinctly because I am actually sitting in the exact same chair in the exact same space right now. I smelled the bomb again. And I wouldn't have known that I had smelled it when it happened, but all of a sudden, my whole body reacted, and I stopped listening to whatever they were talking about on the conference call. And I looked out the door of my office because I was convinced another bomb had just gone off.
Wow.
And it hadn't. And at some point, the thinking part of my brain said, okay, we don't see any smoke, fire. We don't hear any sirens. We don't know what this is, but it isn't another bomb. And that's when I discovered, I don't understand this. I can't explain it. I put on the exact same clothes the next day when I got up. I don't think I ever put on the same clothes 2 days in a row, but for some reason that day. And so I did smell the bomb because it had permeated my clothes, and I was wearing those clothes again.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. So, you're experiencing this, clear sort of reaction to this traumatic event, emotionally, you're feeling it, you're feeling alone in these feelings. How long did it take you before you, found some help in that, and help sort of in terms of the perspective piece of it? And what sort of triggered that, you getting help?
It's a great question. And I will tell you that from what I have been told since, what I did was quite unusual. I sought help from a mental health professional a week later. And I'll explain a little bit how that happened, but I have learned since then that it's quite unusual for people to seek formal mental health treatment immediately after something like this happens. But I had been struggling so much with my emotions and my feelings and my responses in that week. And at 2:49 p.m. on the following Monday, the city held a moment of silence. And I think I probably turned on the TV or logged onto the computer to watch as the mayor sort of led this, event, and was in honor of the individuals who had been killed. And so that was at 2:49 p.m. I imagine they said some words. I don't recall. But it was probably by 3:00 or 3:30 that day that I was on the phone to my doctor's office and their behavioral health department. I just realized I don't understand what's happening to me. I don't know how to deal with it. But I did think to myself, well, this is what therapists get paid for. They know how to do this. So I started seeing, that's when I discovered that there is such a thing as an emergency mental health appointment. And they got me in by lunchtime the next day, which was awesome. And I saw this person who was a talk therapist for a few months. And while that was happening, I knew I still wasn't okay, and I needed more help. And I was at an event where a Red Cross volunteer was there with resources to help anybody who was impacted by the bombing. And they had a list of counselors, trauma counselors, that anybody who was impacted by the bombing could go to for free. So I started seeing a trauma counselor, and then they had some groups of people who were at the finish line, most of us without physical injuries, a few with some of the more minor physical injuries. And there were weeks where I had 3 therapy appointments with the talk therapist, the trauma counselor individually, and the trauma counselor as a group. And sometimes that did not feel like enough.
And what have you gleaned in terms of, you had mentioned that it's not common to reach out, that quickly after a traumatic event. What did you glean about the common experience?
My understanding of the more common experience is that people will seek out formal mental health care kind of when they get to the end of what they know how to do to help themselves. And we all have different levels of self-care and what we know to do to take care of ourselves in situations like this. So I think also some people will never seek formal mental health care, even if it might be beneficial, because there still is a lot of denial. And you mentioned earlier the stigma. We all have that stigma. Not all of us, but if you have the stigma, you often have it about yourself as well. And so people sometimes just won't get help because they don't think they need it. Many people don't need it, but some do. I think, probably what I did was exactly the same thing. It's just that I very quickly ran out of what I knew to do to help myself. And, I had been to therapy in the past, so I was comfortable with the idea of seeing a therapist. And that seemed to me the most logical next step to get help.
And what did it look like for yourself prior to the therapist? Was it just, the crying, the sort of, what was going on in your noggin prior to that?
Yeah, definitely a lot of crying, a lot of anxiety. I mentioned the, smelling the bomb and thinking it was there.
Yeah.
Well, that smell followed me everywhere I went that day. So I was outside and I smelled the bomb, and I would get anxious and I would kind of get into some sort of protective crouch, ready to take care of myself. And actually, it wasn't until I stopped and asked a police officer who was protecting the crime scene at every entry point. I asked him, is it possible that the scent of the bomb is still in the air? Because I keep smelling it. And he told me about a friend of his who was a police officer who had been right at the finish line, who showered for about 2 hours and felt like he couldn't get the smell out of his hair. And that's when I realized, oh, it's just all over me. It's in my hair. It's on my clothes. So I was, early on, a lot of anxiety and panic attacks, which I didn't understand, definitely not having any panic attacks that I could have identified before. And I also had intrusive thoughts, which I'd never had before, sort of along the lines of what people talk about when they talk about flashbacks. But I would be somewhere like in the subway station and suddenly it would explode and there'd be fire and body parts and parts of the train and smoke everywhere and people around me dead. And I would be sort of in my mind being like, well, I'm okay. I'm standing here watching all this happen. And my body was reacting as if I was under threat, frozen in place. And then I would kind of come out of it and just be standing in whatever room I was in. And obviously this thing hadn't happened. So those were the most frightening things that happened, because I suppose a little bit I can intellectually understand if I can't sleep or I'm having nightmares or if I'm feeling a little anxious, but the intrusive thoughts the thoughts themselves were scary, but then the fact that I was having the thought was scary, and thinking of how on earth can I stop this was also very frightening. So those in particular were even more distressing to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful that you sought, help, and even after seeing a talk therapist, realizing you needed additional help. I think that takes a great deal of insight and courage to reflect on that, right? And so I'm glad, I'm so grateful you did that.
Oh, thank you. I don't know that it was an intellectual decision. It just it's the only thing I could think of, so I did it.
Yeah, I know. I'd imagine there are a lot of just biological sort of responses that we have as humans who sort of come from caveman, right? We have these initial lizard brain responses, and a lot of them are in protection, right? We're sort of protect mode.
Yes. Yes. And that's I learned that throughout all of this, is that was what was happening, and that I needed to actually find a way to turn that off, because my body was still feeling like I was under threat. Even though, I mostly wasn't.
Right. And did you learn how to turn that off in your trauma therapy?
Yes, I learned all sorts of techniques, and we did a lot of work to kind of help me place the trauma in my life, understand its role in my life. And I ended up, this was actually a couple years later, but I did EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I couldn't begin to tell you why it works. And I know that some people think it's controversial, but I can say that in my case, it did work. And it really helped me be able to kind of understand that what was underlying some of my responses, even 2 years out, was that I wasn't feeling safe. And to understand how something like standing across the street when a bomb goes off can make you feel unsafe. And it really got me to a point where I could remember the bomb and remember the circumstances without, going down the rabbit hole of the actual emotional side of those responses. Right. I could remember it with the same emotional content as telling you about the laundry that I did yesterday. And that was huge. And then
I mean, laundry is pretty traumatizing. So.
well, actually, it can be. It depends.
I know.
And I have a lot of techniques like self-talk, breathing exercises. I do a lot of mindfulness and meditation. So I've built up a lot of tools so that if I get frightened or if I'm feeling unsafe or if I'm triggered, I'm able to kind of talk myself through it and understand what's happening, kind of take that step back from the emotional side of it and understand what's going on and deal with it kind of at a meta level.
Mm. Yeah, I've had a few friends who've talked to me about EMDR, and I actually had an EMDR therapist on the show. And the friends who've gone through it themselves, it says they've told me it's been a life changer for them. Because the way I understand it is that we have traumatic experiences, and then they sort of get stuck, and if we sort of come across a feeling that is resonant of that traumatic experience, or a smell, right? Or, it'll take us back to that exact moment, and it will be sort of encased in all of that emotion as it was back when we had that traumatic moment. But EMDR allows us to integrate those experiences. And so we can, as you pointed out very well, go back there and not be so triggered and so impacted.
Yes. And for me, the experience of going through EMDR was incredibly emotionally painful. And so I haven't mentioned a specific diagnosis. I was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the ways it manifests itself is in some physical issues. And for me, that was tendinitises, muscle spasms, muscle cramps, and things along that line. And the EMDR was incredibly difficult for me emotionally. And there were times when I walked out of the room unable to walk because one time in particular, it felt as if I had broken my ankle. It was in that much pain. And I kind of hobbled out and got myself to the subway and got home. And by the time I got home, it had worked itself out because it wasn't a pain that was born from a physical injury. It was just my body needing to deal with it in some way. And for me, I would come home and just go straight to bed. So luckily I work for myself. So I quickly realized to schedule my days so that I didn't have any meetings or deadlines on the days I did EMDR, because I would just crawl straight into bed and sleep for the rest of the afternoon.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. It's amazing to me how we can hold those things in our bodies, in our physical bodies, right? They're all,
yes.
It's all so connected. I'm sure you've read The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes, I have. I got my hands on that pretty quickly after the bombing because I felt like, no, I feel this in my body. Something's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a book that I reference all the time on this show because it is like it's one of my all-time favorites. And listeners, if you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, do so. It's incredible. It's very profound, and it gets into all this trauma stuff. So after you started going to EMDR and you get your diagnosis of PTSD, my perception of you now is that you are a person who is, very openly and eloquently talking about this stuff. Why do that? Help me understand your aim there.
That's a great question. And so my journey after the bombing has included a tremendous amount of anger. And for me, that anger has been directed at the people in charge of the response. So the city, primarily a little bit the state, because there wasn't outreach to people like me, to people who were, there at the finish line or nearby and who experienced it, but who were lucky enough to walk away without physical injuries. There were lots of resources, and rightly so, for the folks who were catastrophically physically impacted, and for the families of those who were murdered. Those folks needed a lot of resources, and they got them. But there was no outreach to people like me. And even when I reached out to the city, for example, I emailed our mayor, and now admittedly, it was an incredibly long letter, but it was very detailed, where I talked about the essential message was, hey, I'm here and there are people like me out here. We're dealing with, we were injured too, but we didn't bleed. Can you please take care of us? That was the essential message. And the message I got back from the city said, we don't have anything to do with this. Here's a number to call to get help. So there was, and I even had offered the mayor, I will help you. I will come in and meet with you. Let's sit down and try to figure out how can we help people like me. I was under the impression at that moment in time in the summer of 2013 that they just didn't know that there were people like me out there, that there were people with emotional wounds from this violence. But it turns out, it is known, whether they knew it or not. It is knowable, and it is a known fact after natural disasters and mass violence that many more people, I think the SAMHSA quote that I saw was in their report, it was between, I think, 4 and 50 people will have a psychological wound for every one person who has a physical wound. So it came from this incredible anger at being ignored and just desperately not wanting anybody else to feel the same way after something bad happens like this. So I didn't really know what to do with that energy, but I think it was about 1.5 years later, a friend asked me if I would share my story at a conference for communicators. And there'd be PR people there. And so I said yes. And I was part of a panel. Somebody who was a PR person for the Boston police who was dealing with the bombing in real time, myself sharing my story of being a survivor. And I kind of looked at it as a communication issue, that you just need to plan to communicate with this group of people. And, that's all you need to do. I've learned since then why the emotional side doesn't get the same attention as the physical side. And it isn't as simple as not knowing how to communicate. But early on, that was what I was thinking. It's kind of a communications issue. And my section of the panel was very well received. They asked us to speak at their international conference the next year. And I realized 2 things: that it was very healing for me to tell my story in an environment where people were actually listening to learn from what I was saying. And that it was very meaningful to me to think, I can probably draw a straight line between the words coming out of my mouth to at least one person in this audience changing how they behave and how they react the next time they're dealing with somebody who has gone through a disaster of mass violence. Because I ended up speaking to emergency management personnel, Homeland Security folks, first responders, dispatchers, all of the people whose job it is to take care of us when something horrible happens. So because I could think each time I'm helping at least one other person, and hopefully more than just one other person, who in the future is going to experience mass violence, that was very meaningful to me and has helped in my healing as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's so amazing. I love the fact that you had that opportunity to share your story and to show people. And I think what is important is that, you had commented on it. Those people are there to learn, right? And they're there to see you, and they're seeing you for who you are in that moment, which I think is a big part of, empathy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having that opportunity to share and to give people a way into, these emotional experiences that we have as people, and we talk about it a lot on this show, and this space is about sharing emotional experiences, but the emotional experiences they're real and they're valid. And, it continues to flummox me that they get lost in the mix. But they do because of stigma, they do because of fear, and they do because of a lack of, emotional intelligence and understanding and willingness to go there, because it is uncomfortable, right? It is, as we went back to the middle, or as we go back to the beginning, when we talked about the messy middle, it is messy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's scary, but that's where the real stuff happens.
When I give my talks, especially early on, sometimes there still is a little voice in the back of my head that says, why are you even talking about this? Nothing even happened to you. And I have learned to embrace the little, the voice of stigma in my own head. And sometimes people in the audience would have that kind of feedback. I actually presented at a conference for first responders, and all of the people who ask questions live and in the moment, or who come up afterwards to talk, are very supportive, and they have good questions, and it's clear they're trying to understand. Even if they're kind of challenging me, it's clear that they're wanting to understand what's going on. But the people who have the negative comments and the people who still believe the stigma usually submit the anonymous comments that I then get later. And one person from this conference said she was very selfish. She wasn't even hurt, and she said she suffered. And that just cut like a knife when I read that. And then a friend of mine said, what that's actually telling you is how important what you are saying is. Because even a first responder whose job is to come to the aid of somebody on the worst day of their life isn't understanding the importance of the emotional side of things. So I've now, when I read those kind of comments, I just kind of take them as a challenge now. Okay, well, there's obviously more people I need to convince.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. More work to be done. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So, now you're in a place where you're talking about your story, you're speaking at conferences about your experience and the psychological wounds, that we hold as people. Can you, do you get into the area of, violence toward women, violent toward people, people of color, that type of thing?
That isn't something that I have yet typically addressed head on, but I do acknowledge, and I hope that I am able to communicate when I'm speaking about this, that while my experience comes from mass violence, it's just that the cause is different in my case than it is for other people, because people can experience this from sexual assault, from domestic violence, from the trauma of having their home burned down around them. So while I come from a place of experiencing mass violence, and that is an important piece of it, I do recognize that, there are people out there who feel the same way that I do, or even, more marginalized and ignored from events that didn't make the news and weren't the only thing on CNN for 5 days in a row.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and thank you for saying that. And it made me think about the fact that, your experience, this trauma that you experience is one of those, big T traumas, right? Like people talk
Yes.
about it in that way, or therapists do. And it's, it was in the news, right? It's this big thing, even though you felt, invisible, but the whole trauma experience itself was like this big news thing, and everyone heard about the Boston Marathon bombing. I want to remind you and myself and the listeners like that it's important that we're not comparing in these situations. I think that it's still like when we experience a thing that feels traumatic, big T, little t, doesn't matter. It's a real emotional trauma that we're experiencing. And it doesn't need to be this, big televised event that happens, and relating those two or comparing those two experiences isn't helpful. And I say that, very much toward myself too, because I do it, right? And I think we're, to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I think we're doing it a little bit now, right? In the time of coronavirus, like comparing our like, oh, I have it this way, and therefore I don't have any right to feel bad, right? And that's wrong. It's important to recognize your pain and your emotional experience, and also hold into account the fact that other people have had different experiences. Like we can hold all of that.
Yes. And thank you for saying that. It can be difficult to hold all of those things at the same time,
Sure.
especially when you yourself are feeling traumatized.
Yeah.
I have read a couple times, and I'm not sure if this is attributable to anybody in particular, but the thought is that everybody gets to have their own trauma be the worst thing that ever happened to them. So you and I can be standing next to each other and have very different experiences, and you walk away fine and I'm traumatized, but that gets to be the worst thing that ever happened to me if that's how I feel about it, whatever you think about it. And I think we do comparisons, and it can be hard to have that compassion and empathy for somebody else when you're thinking to yourself, oh, that's nothing.
Right.
Look what happened to me. And I've experienced that in the world of survivors of the bombing. There's one particular person I know who often has said to me that what happened to them wasn't this person walked away without any physical injuries, but was emotionally wounded like me, but believes that to this day, I believe they don't think they have a right to feel bad because other people were killed. So they think, well, I lived, so I don't have a right to complain. And so I think it's natural. So many of us do it. We make those comparisons, whether it's to diminish what happened to ourselves or to judge what's happening to other people. It can be so hard to just hold on to your own experience and let other people's experience be their own experiences.
Yeah, our experiences don't cancel out others, and vice versa. They both exist. Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. So, one of the things that you talk about in, one of the things that you mentioned on your website, and I'd imagine you talk about it in some of your speaking engagements, is this idea of resiliency, right?
Mm-hmm.
What goes into resiliency? Maybe for you, like what from your perspective, like you having sort of been a survivor, right? You have this PTSD diagnosis. Like when you're looking at yourself, what are the attributes of, me as a resilient person?
Ooh, that's a good question. And before I answer it, I'm going to say, I hate the word resiliency. Because it goes to what we were just talking about. The first time I heard it, after the bombing, I didn't feel resilient at all. And I felt like, well, compared to everybody else, I'm not resilient. So this is a terrible thing. I don't want to hear about how great everybody else is doing, because that's how I took it, that resiliency meant other people were doing, quote unquote, better than I was. So it's absolutely a word that we use and people know what it means. It's still not my favorite word, but it is pretty handy to describe resiliency. And, we all have some level of resiliency because we're all still here. And I don't think I had a lot of resiliency back in 2013. And for me, I've learned I think it's kind of all the things we've talked about. I've learned to be compassionate with myself and understanding of my feelings and my emotions and what's happening to me. I've particularly learned and had to relearn multiple times that I can't control what happens to me, but I can control how, to a degree, I can control how I respond to things. That's been a huge one for me. Building up my personal relationships has been a big element of resiliency. Making sure that I am a support for my friends and that they are supports for me. I kind of came into this, pretty well stocked in that area, but I now kind of recognize how important social relationships and family and friends are in one's own resiliency. And though I didn't know it at the time, doing things like writing the letter to the mayor and advocating for attention to the mental health injuries after these kind of events and speaking at conferences, that's all kind of a way that I've made meaning out of this. And I think as humans, we try to, make meaning out of things. And I think being able to do that is an element of resiliency.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your complicated relationship with the word. I also have a complicated relationship with the word. When I think that there sometimes, like, I have this hypersensitivity to, sometimes this mindset that persists in our culture that says we need to kind of move beyond things, right? And
Yes.
and right, we need to like find the silver lining and all these things, right? And I don't think that there's any sort of ill will in some of that sentiment, but I do think that sometimes it can not be cognizant of the emotional complexity, right? And sometimes there isn't meaning, right? Sometimes there, we're not going to find a silver lining. Sometimes it's just shit, right? And
Yes.
and that's, that is like a recognition that that things are messy, right? That things are gray sometimes. And that's my sort of misgivings about the word resiliency. But I do think it's important. I do think that resiliency as a person is, in your example, it's honoring ourselves, right? It's being true to who we are and recognizing that we deserve to be seen, right? And
Yes.
there's a resiliency in that's how I like to look at it.
I'm really glad you brought up your complicated relationship with the word as well, because I do think it's kind of got two meanings. So there's a resiliency on the personal level, what you and I and others do to, pick ourselves up after we've fallen. whatever that is some sort of resiliency. Unfortunately, I think it's used on a broader scale. Maybe, I'm not sure at the whole level of society, but, city governments will talk about how resilient our city is. And that's definitely happened here in Boston. And I have to admit that to me, it comes across as kind of claiming victory. We're going to say we're resilient, and that means we're all fine.
Right.
And like you said, we're going to claim we're resilient because we need to find the silver lining, and we want people to stop whatever they're doing about this. We want them to stop crying about it. We want them to. So I have found it it feels like a bludgeon when somebody's saying you should be resilient, or telling me you are resilient, or saying, hey, we are Boston strong, we are resilient. Like, to me, that is where the complication comes in, because you can't tell me what it means to be resilient. And I feel like we are dismissing people when we say things like that. So as a personal concept, I think we all have some level of it. But when you kind of get to that higher level, I don't like how people talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Like, I really appreciate, you speak about it with, obviously you do it kind of for a living. You speak about it with such eloquence, and I'm grateful that you're here talking about it, because it is such a, the experience of trauma, just as a sort of general concept, is so human, and the reactions to trauma are so human. And I'm so grateful that you're talking about it in this eloquent sort of way that's being mindful of the emotional aspect and all of that personal sort of unique emotional experience. I'm just so grateful that you're doing it.
Oh, thank you for saying that. It's been a wonderful conversation. You've asked really thoughtful questions and added your own perspective as well. And I feel like I've walked away with even better understanding of it as well. So thank you to you too.
Oh, thanks. Well, let's start wrapping up. We always wrap up the show talking about our empathy heroes. So these are people in our lives who embody empathy. They could be people we know personally. They could even be characters from a movie or a book we love, or even a quote that sort of illuminates what empathy is. I will go first to name my empathy hero this week, to give you a moment to think about yours. My empathy hero this week is actually a collection of people. So last week I had recorded I had done a little Facebook Live event for the Mighty on growing in connection with others. And I talk a lot about empathy and vulnerability and emotional curiosity as being important parts of connection and how we connect with ourselves and others. And there was about, maybe 50 or 60 or so people there live. I think the video, got maybe 6,000 views or so. But I just wanted to call out the empathy heroes that were there and asking just such thoughtful questions about the topics that I was discussing, and engaging with each other. And even like in the chat, giving each other empathy and myself empathy in that moment. And it was just such a warm sort of connecting experience that I really cherish. So the Mighty event attendees are my empathy heroes this week.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
My empathy hero, there's only one name that popped into my head when you asked that. It's a woman named Margie Worrell. She's an Australian woman, and she has several books, including one that's called Brave. And I discovered her work actually through a work project several years ago after the bombing. And I was reading her work on what it means to kind of live your bravest life, and just discovered, she talks a lot about compassion and empathy for yourself, in deciding to follow your dreams and live bravely. And I've had a couple opportunities to meet her in person. I've attended a couple of her Live Brave Women's weekends that were absolutely life-changing. The first one, I actually flew to Australia to go to. Let me be honest, when I saw it, I decided I wanted to go without actually realizing it was in Australia. So it was quite the decision to do it. And, I met these almost 30 amazing women on top of meeting Margie, who all just greeted me with such compassion and empathy and really empowered me. So I'd say she is my empathy hero, Margie Worrell.
Amazing. And listeners, I'll make sure to link Margie's stuff in the show notes for this episode. Manya, where can people connect with you online?
They can visit my website, which is manyachylinski.com, or you can find me for social media. I usually hang out on Twitter, and my username is Manya Chylinski. Pretty straightforward. Talk a lot about trauma and mental health. Also on Twitter, a little bit about marketing. That's my day job. That's where you can find me.
Excellent. Well, listeners, those will also be linked in the show notes for this episode. Manya, thank you again so much for being a part of You Me Empathy.
Oh, thank you, Noan. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And to you listeners, as I always say, I'm here, you're here, we're here together on this wayward, overwhelming, awe-inspiring pale blue dot. We have each other. It's you, me, empathy.
La, la, la.